My name is Aksel, and I'm going to talk about our research called the Unpatchables, Why Municipalities Persist in Running Vulnerable Hosts. This is a research study we did at Delft University of Technology. I'm a PhD candidate there. It's also a study we did in collaboration with the sector CERT called the Informatiebeveiligingsdienst, the IBD, which is the Dutch sector CERT for municipalities. Now, this study started in 2022. And just to give you a bit of background, in that time, there was a popular media discourse on stating something along the lines of many systems are vulnerable. This was prevalent in the news, but also in Dutch cyber policy documents. At the same time, several municipalities were hit with cyber attacks, particularly ransomware attacks. And when I speak of municipalities, I mean local governments. This is different in every country. The Americans have municipalities, but the British use councils. So what I focus on is local government. Industry reports at the time were stating that a lot of attacks happen through exploiting known vulnerabilities, so simply unpatched software. And this kind of happens against the background of an institutional framework that's supposed to help organizations mitigate cyber threats. And one of the things that these organizations do, so these are CERTs and CERTs, they do many things. They help, they offer assistance, but one of the things that they do is they send out vulnerability notifications. But there are a few assumptions when you do that. If you send out vulnerability notifications, you assume that you can correctly identify the vulnerable system, that you can correctly attribute that system to the organization, and you assume that the constituent correctly mitigates or at least manages that system. And as I'll show, this research will show that these assumptions do not always hold true in practice. So we surveyed the literature at the time. There were several studies on measuring vulnerable hosts through network scans. There were some studies on interviews with system administrators. But what was lacking was ground truth data with practitioners on how they were actually managing vulnerable hosts. So we formulated two research questions. First, how accurate are these network scans? Are the systems that we measure as being vulnerable actually vulnerable in practice? And the second question, why are they not patched? What were the considerations that these network defenders were making why they were not patched? For example, you can imagine that a system might be vulnerable, but they might have specific mitigation strategies in place for this specific vulnerable host. And the way we went to address that is, first I focused on local government. After the presentation, feel free to reach out to me because I actually started with national government, but during the research we pivoted to local government. We collaborated with the sector CERT, and that gave two huge benefits. First, it helped us introduce the research team to Dutch municipalities. Initially, I reached out to municipalities individually. And if you want to talk about why your systems are vulnerable, that takes a lot of effort, and that takes a lot of relationship building to get an interview. But with the CERT, we were able to reach out to constituents directly. And the second benefit of the CERT is that when a constituent, so a municipality, registers at the CERT, they hand over a list of assets that they are responsible for. In this case, IPv4 addresses. So we have a list of all the IP addresses of Dutch municipalities. Next, we scanned those IP addresses with passive scanning services to identify vulnerable services. And with that list, we were able to reach out to municipalities to conduct interviews with the practitioners. So a bit more on how we did the scanning. We scanned approximately 300,000 IPv4 addresses for 322 municipalities, which is roughly 93% of all municipalities. So the CERT has a very high coverage on who they are assisting. Now, how did we determine a vulnerable service? We used passive scanning services. We used Sense and Shodan. We collected banner information, and from that, we parsed the banner to collect the common platform enumeration identifier. So what service is running with what version? And we used that CP identifier to link it to vulnerabilities known in the National Vulnerability Database. If a service had one or more CVEs of any severity measured by CVSS score, we considered it a vulnerable service. Now, there are some limitations to that method. They are listed in the paper. But nonetheless, we observed approximately 70 different unique vulnerable services. And we observed it in 154 unique hosts in 94 different municipalities. So it was quite prevalent. One thing I do want to highlight is we did not do active scanning. This was due to the nature of the collaboration agreement. But yeah, so we've still found a lot of vulnerable services. Now, we have the organizations, we have the vulnerable hosts. With that list, we reached out to the municipalities. And we did so in 16 interviews. And the fun fact is we actually reached out to well over 30, 35, 36 municipalities. But getting an organization to talk about why they're running vulnerable hosts is quite hard and takes a bit of convincing. But nonetheless, we still had 16 interviews. As you can see, we interviewed 29 practitioners in those interviews. So that means several practitioners were present during a talk. And this might not feel pure. This was my feeling initially also. But it actually was very beneficial because a lot of organizational knowledge was present in that interview. So imagine 3 system administrators. If one didn't know the answer, the other one could complement it. So a lot of organizational knowledge was actually present. You also see that we covered 54 municipalities. And this is due to the fact that resources are scarce in local government land, so a lot of shared resources. Some organizations facilitate several municipalities, or one IT team did the IT work for several groups. So that's how we reached a higher coverage. And when you do interviews, there are always risks and things to watch out for, but 2 things were particularly important during these interviews. First, the social desirability bias. There's a way how things should be going and how things are actually going. And we want to hear about the latter. So we focused on actual systems. And this was very important in the interview because if you discuss an actual system, there's no way to hide behind the facts. But another thing is, what you have to realize is if you talk about a vulnerable host, you are sort of implying that someone is not doing their job right. So we insisted on bosses not being present during the interview because you put someone in a very vulnerable position. But you do want to hear the truth why something is happening as it is. I think only in 2 cases the CISO was present, but it was quite a tight-knit team. So I do have the feeling that people were able to speak quite freely. More details on the respondents in the paper, obviously. Okay, so back to those assumptions that I started with. The first one is, are these vulnerable systems correctly identified? And the short answer is very simple, yes. Everything that we measured, so we measured the CPE, was actually confirmed by the sysadmins. We confirmed this for 42 different services, so vulnerable and not vulnerable. And one thing that you cannot guarantee is that there is a backport running. It's not something we could necessarily measure in the banner. So we asked the respondents, and none of the respondents indicated that they used backboards. So for our measurement, this was an assumption that was actually true in practice. Now the second assumption is, are vulnerable systems correctly attributed? And here things start to crack a little bit. Because what happened during those first few interviews was that when we handed over the list of IPs of vulnerable hosts that we wanted to discuss, practitioners were saying, I don't know this IP. Which is actually quite surprising because it's the CERT, it's the constituent, the municipality, that hands over its list of assets to the CERT. So we adapted our research design because we still wanted to talk about why hosts were vulnerable and we wanted to maximize that number. So we asked practitioners, what are the IPs that you are responsible, or at least that you feel responsible for? And we scanned those beforehand. And it was a surprise, and it took a while before we realized that this is actually a finding, because we were measuring a misalignment in the IPs that an organization is attributing, or the IPs that are attributed to an organization. And we could measure this, because we measured 18 vulnerable hosts that were observed by the CERT, attributing those hosts to a municipality, which the practitioners did not consider themselves responsible for. The opposite, 6 vulnerable hosts were observed by practitioners and not by the CERT, and 9 vulnerable hosts were observed both by the CERT and the practitioners. And the way we measure this, or I think we can illustrate this quite clearly, if you visualize the IP as a set per organization, what we're looking at here are the misalignment for 3 different organizations, left, middle, right. And we're looking at a Venn diagram is the set of IPs that is attributed to the organization. The blue diagram are the set of IPs that the practitioners consider themselves responsible for. The yellow or orange is the IPs that the CERT attributes to an organization. And the small green Venn diagram is the actual vulnerable host. What you would expect is one set, right? Or a maximum overlap and 0 vulnerable hosts. But this was not the case. Not just for these 3 organizations. This happened for every organization that we interviewed. So this misalignment was quite prevalent. Right, so we go through the third assumption then. How were these systems actually managed or mitigated? We identified roughly 4 categories on how these vulnerable hosts were managed. The first one was practitioners were actually unaware of the vulnerable host. And this came in sort of 3 flavors. Either a system was retired and it was still online, so it was out of the scope of the practitioners. The system was not recognized anymore in the asset inventory. So simply it could be an Excel list, wasn't present in that list anymore. Or third, the system was not identified as being vulnerable. A second category was that practitioners were unable to fix a vulnerable host. So it was on the radar, but due to some governance structure that they were in, for example, different parties were responsible for different layers in the network or in the application. They knew, but they couldn't actually fix it. The third category are retired systems. This is different than the previous example because these retired systems were still on the radar of the practitioners. You can imagine this is local government, things are not going super fast, so things are being phased out. We measured it, they said, yeah, we know it's disconnected, it's discontinued, it's going to be offline soon. And the final category is not something we could actually measure, but did come up during interviews. And that is one way to manage a vulnerable host is to actually turn it down or shut it off, disconnect it from the internet. And many practitioners said, or several said, while this is a real option in our toolbox, we never do this in practice because business concerns always trump security. And the bullet on the bottom, one of the things that we had in mind when we want to find out why systems weren't patched, we thought maybe vulnerable hosts there were mitigation strategies in place specific for that vulnerable host, but that really didn't turn out to be the case. So what can we conclude? This misalignment, we observed at every organization. So that says something about your network perimeter. It is fluid. And what this also shows is that we are measuring shadow IT. Many assets are fleeting or are even unreported. One of the respondents said it quite well, that we have a view on those systems that are reported, but not on the ones that are not reported. So imagine that's a marketing team spinning up assets. If it's not reported, the security team cannot measure it or monitor it. And I think this is a very important conclusion, because this institutional framework that we rely on, where we notify owners of vulnerable hosts that they have a vulnerable system, that is severely undermined if you cannot correctly attribute the owner of that system. What we saw is that practitioners do not consider themselves responsible for a system that we notified them about, or they even knew who was responsible. Many cases, we couldn't find out who was the owner of that IP or if it even belonged to the organization. And as a result, these systems remain vulnerable. So I hope to have whetted your appetite to our paper, showing that these assumptions, the first assumption of this framework holds, the second doesn't, and the third one is quite problematic in practice. I hope you read the paper. I'd love to collaborate. These are my research directions. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions.